Welcome to the Inconvenient Minority Podcast. I'm your host, Kenny Shu. Joining me today is Keri Smith. Keri Smith is the co-host of the Unsafe Space podcast. Many followers. It's a great podcast. Really excited to get on board with her today. Hi, Keri.
Hi, Kenny. Thanks for having me. You have a great name. You have a great name for your podcast.
Thank you. Inconvenient Minority Podcast. You know, we're just trying to get different voices and different people to talk about race, identity, and culture, but I think in ways that, challenge the predominant narrative today.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm excited to talk to you. I know it's also named after your book that's coming out soon, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. An Inconvenient Minority. And, Keri, one of the reasons why I wanted to get you on this podcast was, I heard a little bit about your background, and I heard a little bit about, you kind of coming from a small town in South Carolina, in Chesney, South Carolina, and then going to Duke University, and then just getting imbibed with this ideology. And I just want to hear a little bit about kind of a bit of your small town background and how you kind of stood out in kind of a small town, both intellectually and then also regionally.
Well, sure. Well, yeah, I'm from a little town that's outside of Spartanburg, South Carolina. It's called Chesney. And, we went, I think you and I specifically beforehand were talking about gifted and talented programs. And so I'll just start there. We had a program called Project Climb, which was for gifted and talented kids for the whole district. From what I recall, I think it was all of District 2. And so they used to bus us once a week, and we would get to, meet up with kids from other schools. And it was a real blessing for me. I remember from my time in elementary school anyway, it was the only part of my experience that I felt really challenged me. And I noticed a real difference once I got to middle school and high school. I wasn't as engaged, and it wasn't hard for me. This is not bragging. It's just matter of fact. It wasn't hard for me to make straight A's. So I didn't learn a lot of the things that I think you should be learning in school, like how to study, how to prepare, how to time management, because I could kind of just put a little bit of effort in at the last minute and then squeak out an A and coast by. And so it wasn't until I went to I got accepted into the Governor's School for Science and Math in South Carolina, which is a residential high school. It's for 11th and 12th graders, and they have these science and math schools in a lot of states that have lower test scores, where they feel like the gifted and talented are sort of being underserved.
And how many students from your town in Chesney, South Carolina, were accepted into the school for your class?
2 of us, actually.
Wow.
Yeah, it was kind of
you and your best friend.
my other geeky best friend. No, he and I became better friends. Excuse me.
Riding the bus there would help.
He and I became better friends once we got accepted there, because you go and you live there. It's a residential school, and you live there for 11th and 12th grade, and it was very small at the time. I think they've made it larger since then. But at the time, there were 60 of us per grade, so it was 120 students total. And the Governor's School of Science and Math at the time was much more rigorous than Duke was, even once I got into Duke. Yeah, it was one of the greatest blessings of my life to get to go there. I was joking about this with you yesterday, but my brother and sister and I, being from a small town and being kids and somewhat ignorant, we had the false impression when we were very little that, oh wow, we must be like the smartest people in the world. And then and then I got to governor's school, and it was very humbling. I realized, oh no, that's not true at all. I was, somewhere towards the bottom at the governor's school. So it was a great experience for me to have to learn how to study and learn how to put the time in, and to have not just not just teachers who were pushing me, but the other students, were challenging me. And at the time when I was at the science and math school, this is going to age me, but that was in the mid 90s. And so it was not woke. It was very much focused simply on science and math. Imagine that. And it was a great school. And then I went on to Duke University after that. And Duke is where I first came into contact with social justice ideology. I was a women's studies minor. And so I was a biological anthropology and anatomy major. But because of my minor, I was taking a lot of classes in not just women's studies, but in critical race theory and queer theory. And, they didn't have there's been a couple changes since then, since I was indoctrinated into it, I would say. One is that at the time it was called women's studies. Now most colleges don't even call it women's studies because that's now considered transphobic and problematic. Now it's called gender studies.
Oh boy.
The other difference was that the social justice classes were sort of limited to race and sex and gender and sexuality, but now they've expanded, and now a lot of colleges have things like fat studies and mental health justice, that kind of stuff. So it's really expanded since then, because I was learning all this it was over 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. So, it's interesting that you mentioned both your environment in the governor's school and then also your environment in Duke. And you even claimed that the math and science environment in the governor's school in your high school was more rigorous than that of Duke. And, I'm interested, this podcast is about race, identity, and culture, right? And I'm interested in the kinds of people and the kinds of students who would, go to both of these programs. So, let's start with, your governor's school in science and math. In South Carolina, I'm guessing, South Carolina probably didn't have a lot of Asian Americans at the time. Asian Americans tend to score higher on science and math scores, and probably, if the admissions are truly merit-based, would probably disproportionately get into these kinds of things. But, in your science and math governor's school, how would you say, what kinds of people were there? Were they, kind of nerdy, geeky? Did they come from rural backgrounds such as yourself? Did they come from, heavily urban areas? What was it like?
Yeah, we probably had a disproportionately high number of Asian students compared to the population of Asian people in South Carolina in general. We definitely had a lot of kids who were not originally from South Carolina. We had a lot of kids who had moved around, who were Army brats and had, I remember some of my friends from there even, had lived abroad for parts of their life. And, but there was also a good representation of kids like me who were from rural areas of the state who were being underserved. And one of the smartest guys I remember there, I think he was from a really small town in South Carolina. He was so funny. He was the kind of guy, he was such a nerd. He was the kind of guy who, when you play I Spy something red, we would be on field trips and he would be in the van, like, I spy something of the wavelength of 670 nanometers. And I'm like, okay. I love geeks like that. I was like,
yeah.
You gotta make me work to play this game.
Yeah. Oh man, I have to think now.
Yeah, it was a really special place because I think a lot of times it's changed now, but at the time, there was this stigma. There were all these groups that, you in high school, middle school, this sort of, you get put in different groups. Are you one of the hippies or one of the stoners or the goth or the jocks and that kind of stuff? And I was definitely one of the nerds at my little school. And then when you get there, you're in a school full of nerds. And so there's not really that same way of grouping. Everyone, I think anyway, it was my experience that people felt really free to just be themselves. And I learned so much from going to that school, aside from just how great the courses were. I learned a lot about socialization and being yourself and freedom of expression and being comfortable with people of all kinds of different backgrounds and religions. And it definitely exposed me to people, like, for example, in my small town was predominantly Christian, and not just Christian, but Southern Baptist. And so being in governor's school was my first time being around people who were atheists or Jewish and different faith systems. And so that was also great for me. But it was one of the best times in my life. And then when I think about that and I compare it to what it was like at Duke, I definitely started moving into this worldview, this social justice worldview. And I would say social justice ideology, it functions like a religion for a lot of people. And it did that for me. It definitely took the place of God for me. It gave me a system of belief that told me how to be good in the world and to do good in the world. And I think it does that for a lot of people. People try to fill that religion or that faith hole with this belief system. And if you are a person who is opposed to racism and sexism and homophobia or any kind of bigotry, it sells itself as a belief system to end those things. And it's not. I actually, 20 years later, have come to the realization that it's the opposite. It actually pushes bigotry. It pushes divisions based on race and sex and, other identity markers. But it's got a very good game. It's very good branding. and so ironically at Duke is when I first started, I would say in retrospect, I can look back and say that's when I first started caging my mind and closing myself off. I was always a really avid reader. I stopped reading as much at Duke and over the next 20 years, because you get to a place where you're just reading the approved cult doctrine is what I would call it now. You're just reading whatever the latest social justice book whether it's Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility or Ibram X. Kendi, you're just reading
How to Be Anti-Racist.
Yeah, How to Be Anti-Racist. You're just reading the stuff that's sort of approved indoctrination literature. And there's a real it works to discourage you from thinking. It works to discourage you from any thoughts that may be counter to the dogma. And so leaving it has been a lot like leaving a mental prison that I didn't even realize I was in for a long time.
So I'm curious, because I largely agree with you, in terms of how women and now gender studies has kind of been corrupted in the discipline. You came from a science and math governor's school, and it was devoted to kind of science and math. But when you came to Duke, you got embroiled in this movement, and you decided that you wanted to go and major in women's studies. And can you point to some experiences, between your time in this STEM-focused high school and this time in Duke, where you I guess drifted away from maybe the governor's school mentality and then more into this Duke mentality?
Yeah, well, first of all, it was a minor in women's studies, but a minor was enough. That was enough to get me in.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I said it functions like a religion, but it actually, I would say it's even more accurate to call it a cult, because not all religions are culty. They can be, but there are some definite cult characteristics that fit with social justice ideology. One of those is that it encourages you to disassociate from people who don't share your beliefs. And especially to disassociate from those who leave the belief system, and it kind of isolates you from friends and family who don't share a belief in this worldview. That's very culty. It also discourages you from asking questions, and it's very effective at getting you to censor yourself. so that everything you're saying and everything you're, posting on social media, you kind of run it through this social justice filter to make sure you're not saying anything that is going to be triggering or problematic or seen as somehow ideologically impure. And there are always these new rules they're coming out with. So there's always new words and phrases they consider off limits. It's a very controlling ideology because it's authoritarian in nature. I've done a lot. I've spent a lot of time thinking about it over the past 4 years and trying to help articulate what it is versus what it claims to be. And one of the things that it is it's very concerned with language. And I think that's because you can control people if you can control their thoughts, and you can control their thoughts if you can control their language. And so it gets people it pushes new definitions of words. So two very important words that it has redefined are racism and sexism. And
yes,
it's redefined racism to mean prejudice plus power, and the same thing with sexism. The way that they say they're doing this, they say they're redefining it in this way so that we can have a way to talk about institutionalized racism and structural racism. Well, that's just not true. We already have words for institutional racism. It's institutional racism. Like, we already have a way of talking about that. Why are you trying to redefine the word racism itself? And if you look at the way it functions, by doing that, they get people who are in the movement, who are opposed to racism. They get them to get on board with judging and treating people differently on the basis of race or on the basis of sex. They get you to do that by changing those definitions and saying, well, it's not racist to treat Asian people differently in the admissions process of this school. It's not racist at all because racism is prejudice plus power. And so the effect of doing that is that you get a lot of some very well-intentioned, well-meaning people are now acting in very racist and sexist ways. And they're doing the mental gymnastics of, they've already accepted these redefinitions. And so that's the way they justify it.
Wait, so do they believe then that Asians have the power? Is that why it's not racist?
This is a good question, because this is one of the places where they contradict themselves. And you're going to start to see, so up until very recently, they would have said, no, Asians don't have power. Asians are just flat, like people of color. They're just in the people of color group, which makes them one of the marginalized groups. But now Asian people as a group have really created a stumbling block for this belief system, because if they want to talk about things like white privilege, and if you point out, well, actually, let's look at groups. Asian people as a group, on average, have higher income, have higher test scores. And these things fly in the face of what they're trying to push. This whole idea of race is what predicts, and racism against people of color is what predicts how successful you're going to be in life. And so we're reaching a point now where I think you're starting to see they are slowly doing like this sleight of hand, where they're starting to push Asian people out of the people of color group. Like, they're starting, you guys are getting assimilated into the white group.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's partially what I discovered, when I was at Davidson College, and, the race ideology definitely hit me hard there. The idea was that Asian Americans were somehow abetting white supremacy, because they were achieving at a level with whites. But I just thought that was such a shallow, that was just such a shallow way of thinking about it, because Asian Americans have not come from historically privileged backgrounds, in the United States. I mean, we face discrimination too. So the explanation cannot just be, oh, we're abetting white supremacy, because our backgrounds are not the same as white Americans. I mean, to even call white Americans as a monolith in itself is crazy. But But even if we were to generalize, it just doesn't seem like we fit with the ideology.
No, Asian Americans create a definite stumbling block, and there are lots of stumbling blocks in the belief system. There's lots of internal contradictions, but it is interesting to see how that it's kind of shifting the language that they're using about Asian people. They've in the Bay Area, my podcast co-host Carter on Unsafe Space, his wife is Asian. And they have noticed that there have kind of an increasing number of these signs and T-shirts that say Asian silence is white violence or Asian silence is violence, and very like specifically calling out Asian people to try and shame or guilt Asian people into speaking the social justice ideology, I think is what that is. I've seen the white silence is violence shirts too, but he said in the Bay Area there's a lot of the Asian silence shirts. But yeah, there's a lot of internal contradictions. I mean, look at one of the new ones. This is one that's evolved in the past maybe 5 to 10 years. Is they've been saying for a long time that race is a social construct. And then they were also saying that gender is a social construct and that gender is separate from and different from biological sex. And now they've gotten to the point where they're saying, oh, wait a minute, biological sex itself is a social construct. So there's no such thing as biological sex other than what we've been socialized to think of these differences, right? And which is absurd, but a lot of them really believe this and will push this. Again, I don't think you can understand how how intelligent people can say something like there's no such thing as biological sex, or to say 2 + 2 = 5, which a lot of them it's become very trendy for them to say this now, unless you understand the way cults work, cult dynamics. And but they've started doing that, and then just really quickly, here's one of their big contradictions. They say because gender and because biological sex are social constructs, that you can choose your gender and your sex. You can choose your sex, but they haven't gotten to the place yet where they're willing to say you can choose your race. Now, some people are starting to say they can because they're trying to remain intellectually consistent. If both are social constructs, then why can't you identify as another race? Why can't you be born into the wrong racial body the same way you were born into the wrong sex? And so there have been several people now. Rachel Dolezal was just the first kind of high-profile one, but there have been several now who have been outed, specifically a lot of white people who have been posing as Black people and as Latino people, and who claim to really identify as Black or Latino people, and they don't know what to do with that because they're not at a place yet where they're willing to say that you can do that. So that's one of the other big stumbling blocks at the moment, I think.
Yeah, that is so interesting. You bring up you are allowed to choose your gender, but you're not allowed to choose your race. I can tell you for sure, the college admission process is so interesting. When I interview, I talk with my friends sometimes, and one of my friends has a Latino, as a grandmother from Colombia. Every other member of his family is white, but he has a Latino grandmother. And when he went through the college admission process, you bet he checked that box. Yeah, I'm Latino.
Yeah.
I'm Hispanic American.
Because if the system is set up to, and for an ideology that likes to talk so much, such a big talk about systemic discrimination, systemic racism or sexism, they sure do enjoy creating systems that discriminate on the basis of race and sex. And so we currently have an admissions process that is systemically racist and sexist, and that will give you extra points if you're a woman or if you're trans or if you're a person of color, of certain color, not Asian kids, but if you're Black or Latino. And so people are, if you set up a system like that, you're going to have people learn how to game the system. Of course they would,
Yeah. People who are smart are smart.
Yeah.
And they'll figure out a way, except for Asian kids, because, Asian kids, we have these, very obvious last names that tell people that we're Asian. And plus these, college admissions people have so much software and data that they can use that even if we don't mark our race, they'll find out about it anyway. And actually, when I was looking at the research for the Ivy League admission system, you realize that they have these massive databases of names. They can find you no matter where you are, no matter what you put down. As long as you have a home address, they can see your picture, and you can for sure know that they use that. They use that to their advantage. Even if you refuse to put your race down, they're going to find you and they'll say, oh, this is an Asian looking face. He's Asian. He's just trying to hide it, which is true. I mean, a lot of us, given the stacked nature of the admissions process against Asian Americans, of course we would try to hide it, Yeah. Of course some of us would try to hide it.
Try to game the system. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you should probably, what's your last name? Zhu?
Shu.
Yeah, you got to
Yeah.
change that to Garcia.
Yeah,
You got to do something to game the system, Kenny.
Yeah. I wanted to, there was this, I wanted to discuss this with you because, there was this article that actually came out in the Columbia Law Review article, in 1995, saying that the main beneficiaries of affirmative action were white women. And the reason why was because evidently, according when these systems, really tried to solve for racial and gender imbalance in power based on exactly the ideologies that you were trying to, that you were saying before, white women were just structurally capable of taking advantage of that more than racial minorities at the time. And they actually benefited most greatly from affirmative action today. And now, actually, if you look at the statistics these days, women, graduate from college, there are more bachelor's degrees handed out to women than to men. Women tend to get higher grades. Women tend to get higher test scores. Women tend to behave better in class, have fewer disciplinary issues, and generally go through the education system at a higher rate. Why do we still say, at least in the educational system, that the power is with men when in the face of all of this?
That's a great question. I think that's another one of those sort of stumbling blocks where any fact that contradicts the belief system, they just disregard it. They simply disregard it. They won't look at it. And I don't actually even hear them address stuff like that. They also don't address, when they want to talk about the so-called wage gap, which I used to believe in wholeheartedly until I started looking at things. They won't address the fact that the wage gap, if you adjust for the fact that, women are more likely to take a lot of time off from the workforce to raise kids, and then come back to the workforce later when they haven't spent all those years building, stepping stones to in their career. They re-enter. They're more likely to re-enter later after having taken a lot of time off, or they're more likely to work part-time jobs. If you adjust for that and you take those women out or those people out, whether they're men or women, and you just look at men and women who've stayed in the workforce and have worked full-time jobs, that the wage gap disappears. And they won't even talk about that. They say this is they simply disregard facts that they don't like as these days I see them called alt-right talking points, or, It's like they just won't even look at it. And the same thing look at when they talk about equity, and they talk about equity in STEM and stuff for women. Well, I don't know if you recall, but Google did an internal audit because they felt like, we're probably not paying our female engineers the same as the men. And they did this audit on salary and gender. And they actually found the opposite, that they weren't paying the men the same amount that they were paying the women. They had to increase the salary of the men Can you believe that? They thought it was going to show one thing and it didn't, but they're not used to looking at the facts. They just kind of say, that's why I say it's like a faith system, because so much of social justice ideology is just taken on faith and it is not based on facts. And they don't like to look at the consequences of policy. Like, so they just look at the intent a lot of the times. If you look at something like, let's take like women entering the workforce, which I'm fully in support of the second wave of feminism and the culturally helping to advance the idea that women can do whatever they want to do and they should be able to work full time if they want to, obviously. And, I'm very happy that happened. At the same time, there is a conversation to be had about what are the effects of that? It doesn't mean I don't think it should happen, but what are the effects and how could we address those? You can't even talk about addressing them if you can't look at it. So, for example, women self-report being much less satisfied and happy today than they did 40, 50 years ago. And if you look at what happened when women entered the workforce, well, suddenly you've got double the number of workers. So what happens? You've got an inflated, and you've got a large supply now of workers. The salaries fall. And so it used to be that you could support a family with like one income. And now a lot of people find that you need two incomes. And so you've got two people in the household, both working full-time jobs, running themselves ragged. And has it helped people to feel more satisfied emotionally and financially over time? I don't know, but we're not even allowed to talk about it because they hear things in those questions that are not there. They would even hear, if you were to excerpt this part of the interview, for example, they would want to say, Keri's saying women shouldn't be able to work. No, that's not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Just saying, can we ever look at the consequences of things and not just the intent? Like, look at the welfare system. Okay, the intent is to help people. The intent is to help families and to have a social safety net for people. But what's the effect? What's the effect of welfare? Well, you do have some conservatives and even Black conservatives like Larry Elder who talk about how it's been cumulatively detrimental across the board to families of all races, but disproportionately to Black families because the welfare system, again, they want to talk about systemic problems. So let's talk about this systemic problem. You've now incentivized not having a father in the home. And what happens over time when you've created an incentive to not have that father in the home? Well, we have seen the rates of fatherlessness increase. We've seen the single parent homes increase across all races, but disproportionately in Black families. And, one of the highest, if you look at the studies on factors that can affect the future success of children, one of those factors that I've seen studies say is the most important is having both parents in the home. That it's even more important than class, than how much money you have. It's more important than race. Yeah. It's more important than sex. And they don't want to talk about that at all. They don't want to talk about the impact on average of not having both parents in the home. The other problem, I think, I'm sorry, I'm rambling, but the other problem is one of the things that I think prevents conversations like this is people either don't understand averages or they do, and they purposefully obfuscate what they're saying for the people who don't understand it. Like they don't, if you say on average, kids do better with both parents in the home, you will have someone inevitably say, well, I didn't have both parents in the home and I went to Harvard. It's like, yeah, duh, that's how averages work. Yeah, are you denying my reality? It's like, no, you're denying math. You don't understand averages. Like, can we not have this conversation? It's like Carter, my co-host always likes to say, it's like saying on average, Asian people are a bit shorter than Black people, and then someone saying, "Well, I know a tall Chinese person." Well, yeah, duh.
Sure. You know a tall Chinese person. Yes.
Yeah.
You know every Chinese person.
It's the same thing now when you see the transgender part of social justice ideology, the trans activism part, which claims to speak on behalf of all trans people and does not, by the way. But that part of the ideology, I've seen that same lack of understanding of averages, where you'll say something like, "Well, men on average, biological men on average, have are going to biological men on average are going to be able to compete at a higher level than women when it comes to something like sprinting." Let's just talk about running, for example. And then someone will say, "Well, I can run faster than my friend who's a man and I'm a woman." And it's like, oh my gosh, are you and your friend elite athletes? No. Do you not understand how averages work? No. Like outliers, the people who are on the high end of that bell curve, it just means there are going to be more of those outliers who are men. And so when you're getting into an elite sport like the Olympics, you're going to see biological men are the ones who are winning those races if you're putting them up against biological women. But I think this is a failing of the public school system, is that people don't understand averages. And now you have things like The Bell Curve, for example. The book by Charles Murray has been totally, completely smeared, to the point where even when I was at Duke over 20 years ago, I didn't read The Bell Curve. I just read opinions about the bell curve, and I knew to avoid it.
For my audience, sorry, I just want to clarify the bell curve. The bell curve is a controversial book written by Charles Murray, social scientist. So, it talks a lot about differences between people. And he has a lot of science to back up what he was saying. But the reason why he got a lot of controversy was because he made some hypotheses about that related specifically to race. But again, it doesn't have to necessarily do with the race of a person, but just the fact that maybe it has to do with the environment that they were raised or cultural upbringing. And he doesn't make conclusions about that, but people interpret it to mean that because people had lower outcomes in certain areas, that it had to do with the person's race. But please go ahead, Keri.
Exactly. And how can you get to the root of a problem if you can't even talk about it? See, they want to say, for example, let's if we talk about the discrimination that's happening in admissions now at these elite universities, the reason they're discriminating against Asian kids and white kids is because they want to see higher numbers of Black and Latino kids. Well, the question there is, why are Black and Latino kids not scoring as high on some of these tests, and why are they not achieving the same grades? And their answer for it, based completely on faith, not on facts, their answer is, well, it's just racism. Well, that you're not going to fix the problem if you're not allowed to actually look at it. And I find so much about social justice ideology now that I'm on the other side of it. So much of it's just they're just not curious. They like I said, they keep you from asking questions or even looking at things. They make you feel ashamed to even want to follow the scientific method or to find truth. It's like you can't even talk about facts or examine them. So they're not actually interested, in my opinion, in ending some of these problems. They don't care about, in my opinion now, and this may sound like I'm kind of judgmental about people who believe what I used to believe, but if you look at something like Black on Black crime, for example, which is higher, and intraracial crime is higher in general. Like white people are more likely to commit crime against other white people. Black people are more likely to commit crime against other Black people. That's just holds true, within races. But the amount of crime that is perpetrated on Black people by other Black people is higher it's disproportionately high, but you're not allowed to look at it. And in my opinion, they don't care about addressing it and figuring out why it's happening and ending it because they don't want you to even talk about it. You can't even look at it.
Right. Right. Another thing about math, since both you and I, we know some math. You went to a math, governor's school. It was pretty rigorous curricula. I mean, what a lot of people in this movement, in the social justice movement, don't understand is just this idea of variance, right? Just this idea of most things happen according to a bell curve. And like, for example, the people demanding racial representation, like equal population representation in certain elite areas of society, like elite college admissions. People are saying we need more representation of Black people in elite colleges or in elite big tech companies like Google and Facebook or those kinds of things. People need to understand, nobody is denying the reality. In fact, even people on the left, except people, on the really far left, would deny the reality that Black Americans today face a comparatively worse educational circumstances than white Americans today, meaning that the people, if you look at, according to a bell curve, Black Americans are less likely to be found on the top end of the population bell curve in terms of academic achievement. So when you're on the lower to be found on the top end of academic achievement at elite schools, which take things exclusively from the top end, from the very top end of the bell curve of academic achievement, then yes, if you're a Black person, or yes, there are disproportionately fewer Black Americans at the top end of of academic achievement, comparatively with Asian Americans who have a median higher academic achievement and test scores. They're disproportionately more likely to be found at the top end. And so, people don't seem to even understand just that at the top end of this curve of academic achievement, there are discrepancies, and you can't try to force or artificially force racial equity in a place that is not even proportionally represented at the top end.
Yes, here's a good illustration of that for anyone who's not following. For example, basketball. On average, you're going to find that the most elite basketball players are Black. And
right.
If you were to take you and your friends, various races, or, white, Asian, Black, whatever, if you're all average players, you're not on the end of the bell curve. You're not elite. So you're going to overlap. All these populations overlap because they're mostly that's where most people are, is in the middle of the curve.
Exactly.
But the outliers.
Definitely, I'm on the lower end. Right. Of the basketball curve.
You're on the lower end of the curve.
I'm definitely bottom 20th percentile. Go ahead.
But on the elite, where you find the biggest differences in any type of any population differences is going to be on the outliers, the people on the end, the top of that curve. And so a pickup game of basketball between a bunch of friends who are not elite athletes, you may not see a huge difference between you and your friends of different races. But if you're looking at the elite level, you're going to see, well, hey, it's who is performing the best in basketball. Oh, it looks like there are a lot of Black people in the NBA. Wow, maybe we should, they're too privileged and we should set up a lottery. Like we should set up a lottery.
The Asians in the NBA, 15%, right?
Right. What if they apply the same equity standards that they're trying to apply towards academic achievement? What if they applied that towards talent in music or talent in sports? And they said, hey, we're gonna start discriminating on admissions into the NBA because we want to make sure that we have a higher representation of Jewish people and Asian people in the NBA. Well, then you're not selecting for the best talent. And I don't know what it is about. this is something I haven't really figured out yet. And so I'm going to be clumsy with my words, but I've been thinking about this a little bit and for a while now. And I'm not sure why people are there's some sort of value judgment that's given to people who are gifted and talented academically that's not necessarily given to people who are gifted and talented in other areas, like in music or in sports. And so I think over time, if we continue on this path towards equity, I think we will see it start to bleed into other areas too, like basketball, like music. We've already seen it bleed into music a little bit. I don't know if you saw, but in July there was an op-ed in the New York Times, and it said that we should get rid of blind auditions when it comes to music. And basically it was saying that, that we started instituting blind auditions decades ago because we came to the understanding that they might be biased along lines of race and gender. And they wanted to see more women and more people of color in orchestras. And so they started instituting blind auditions where you don't see the person who's playing the violin, when you're deciding if they belong in the orchestra or not. Well, now they're arguing because social justice has become a lot more mainstream in the past 5 years, and especially in the last year. Now they're saying, well, hey, we did increase percentages of women and people of color a little bit by doing blind auditions, but not as much as we want. So now we need to get rid of blind auditions so we can look at you and see if you're a woman or if you're a person of color. So we can decide if we want to put you in the orchestra based on your race and sex. It's like, that is the exact opposite of what we should be doing. Keep the blind audition. You don't need to see the race of the person playing the violin. You just need to know if they're playing it well. Like, that's it. I'm sure you're familiar with the short story by Kurt Vonnegut, Harrison Bergeron.
Harrison Bergeron, yeah.
Yeah, that's where we're heading.
Yeah. Yeah. And where the people who are excellent at one discipline are shackled or more burdened. In Harrison Bergeron, the short story, the main character or the title character is so superhumanly strong and smart and excellent that the equity council in the story has to shackle him with all kinds of impairments just to make him, close to a normal human. And that raises an interesting question, Keri, which is just the thing I wanted to touch on with you. And it's this idea of merit, right? It's this idea of merit. You were until recently involved heavily in these social justice circles. And now, I'm seeing the outgrowth of social justice circles implemented into policy. There was a Nicole Hannah-Jones from the New York Times, the author of the 1619 Project, had a tweet out where she said, yes, standardized tests are racist. We should get rid of gifted and talented programs. That's what she said. Yeah. Ibram Kendi, who actually got his start in education, reading all this educational literature, basically railed against standardized tests in his book, How to Be Anti-Racist. I mean, what is the attitude towards the idea of merit right now in these circles?
Well, you've got it exactly right. They're extremely anti-merit. They're aggressively trying to destroy any program that is built to help and to challenge kids who are academically gifted. They want us all to be equal in the rubble, is the way I would put it. They don't believe in merit. And at a certain point, that's why I was saying, do they not see where this ends? Because right now they're just applying it to people who are academically gifted. But at a certain point, it's going to infiltrate into other areas of talent and gift, and it will affect the NBA. It will affect music. It will affect these other places where, like, well, you're just privileged and we need to make sure that this is equitable and that we have a good percentage of all the races and the sexes that we want here. Like they don't see where it ends, or they do and they don't care. I think Ibram X. Kendi, for example, and the 1619 Project are both aimed at destroying everything that has built Western civilization. I mean, in the end, they're opposed to individualism. They want everyone to be, they're collectivists. They want everyone to be treated as group members, which is what white supremacists want. Ibram X. Kendi, to me, is no different morally or ethically than someone like David Duke. He's pushing something just as evil and just as racist. The difference is David Duke is rightly pushed to the margins of society and laughed at, but Ibram X. Kendi is given $10 million by Jack Dorsey at Twitter. Ibram X. Kendi is given 3 Netflix specials to push his racism by the mainstream. Like this type of the reason why I'm so vocal about my old belief system is because not only is it just as racist and harmful as an ideology like white supremacy, but it is actually being propped up and pushed in the mainstream to such a crazy, alarming degree. And it is, I would say, one of the number one ideological threat that we face at the moment. White supremacy is a laughingstock. I mean, if it were anywhere like they like to pretend that we're living in this world full of white supremacists, and they've actually, I think, been, here's the crazy thing about this belief system. It needs the opposing boogeyman. It needs the white supremacists. They need to be able to say, this is a white supremacist country and we have to eradicate all the white supremacists. And so what have they done in the past 4 years as this has become more, the social justice racism has become more mainstream? Well, they've actually been growing white supremacy at the same time. They are funneling disaffected, troubled white people, mostly white men, into white supremacy. They're actually growing it. And that's a real sad thing, because it had reached a point where, the KKK had to appear on shows like Maury Povich, and because nobody supported them, and we could all point and laugh at them, and they couldn't get anybody to come to their rallies. And now it's like I think they're actually recruiting now because of the popularity of the social justice racism. I mean, if you look at something like the Antifa handbook, for example, Antifa is a part of social justice ideology. I would say it's the part of the ideology that is willing to engage in violence. And their handbook says, if you're not a Marxist of some type, if you're not Antifa, if you're not a Marxist, then you're a fascist. They just give you this false dichotomy. You got these two options, right? You're either a Marxist or you're a fascist. And look at someone like Ibram X. Kendi. He's not an Antifa, but he is in the social justice ideology. He says the same thing. He says that it's not possible to be not racist. He says you have to either be anti-racist like me. And what does he mean by anti-racist? He means racist. He means social justice racist. He means judge and treat people differently on the basis of race, but do it in this way. Do it in this way. Okay, so he says you either are racist like me and call yourself anti-racist, or you're a racist. So it's two options, right? It's like they're telling people you're either going to be a social justice racist or you're going to be a white supremacist. Well, for a lot of disaffected, troubled young white guys, if they're being told there's only two options, and both of those options require you to look at the world on the basis of race and to treat people differently on the basis of race, to judge and treat people differently on the basis of race, and they're both collectivists, they're both racist ideologies, but in one of them, your race is put at the top, and the other one, your race is at the bottom. Well, duh, you're going to push people who believe there's only these two ways of being in the world. Well, you're going to push some of them the other way, because they're not going to hate themselves enough to say, okay, I'm signing up for social justice where white people are at the bottom.
Well, and it's, it's different sides of the same coin, right?
Yes.
But if you actually subscribe to the philosophy where your race defines you or defines your condition, which is the philosophy in which this social justice apparatus is rooted in, right? Then if you actually believe that, then of course you would want to position your race at the top. And what I mean by at the top is you want to position your race at the most oppressed position.
Yes. And see,
so that you can get the maximum benefits of being oppressed.
Yeah. And they're both collectivists, and they're both racist, and they both tell you that you should have either collective guilt or collective pride. And both of those things are stupid. I mean, it makes no more sense to have guilt for being white than it does to have pride for being white. There's no, why are you taking on a feeling of guilt or pride based on a group status? Like, you haven't done anything for that. You know, if you're accepting either blame or accolades for people who share your skin color, what? Like,
yeah.
I really believe this is also why, Kenny, you're going to start to see them. And they've already started doing this a bit, but social justice for a long time has kind of hidden the fact that it's opposed to individualism. And they're reaching a point where they're being a lot more open and honest about what their actual targets are. They like to pretend that they're opposed, that their big target is white supremacy, right? It's not their big target. Their big target is individualism, because individualism is the antidote both to things like white supremacy and to social justice belief system. And so they are starting to take the mask off. I've seen in the past year a lot more op-eds and pieces from people who support this belief system where they're openly attacking individualism now. And it started a while back, but now it's gaining momentum. Even in White Fragility, in Robin DiAngelo's book, she openly attacks individualism. They're going to get, as it gains a foothold in mainstream society. And I would say that happened this past June. It became culturally dominant. You've got every corporation speaking social justice ideology now. It's like the revolution the resistance brought to you by McDonald's. It's sort of like, the McDonald's Twitter feed is speaking it, and every major corporation is virtue signaling for this belief system. And so now that it's so culturally dominant, I think they feel like they can be more overt about what their actual targets are. Same thing with masculinity. For a long time, they've said, oh, we're not attacking men. We're not attacking masculinity. We're just attacking this thing that we've coined this term, toxic masculine. That's what we're attacking. Well, the mask is off now. Now they're openly saying, no, it's masculinity. That's the problem. Like,
pretty much. Yeah, it's men. That's the problem. Or it's the idea of men.
Yeah. And I'd say there's something I forgot to say earlier that I wanted to touch on. It's back when I was talking about how when they ignore facts and they ignore anything that doesn't push their narrative forward. When it comes to women in STEM, for example, they're always talking about we need 50% women. And if we don't have 50% women, then it must be because of sexism. Well, they don't say that about fields that don't have high prestige. They don't say we need 50% of garbage collectors to be women. They don't care. like they don't care. It's only things that they view to have high prestige. We need 50% of women. Well, what if women don't want to do those jobs? They never ask that question. Women who are on, if we go back to those bell curves for a second, and you look at the outliers of academic achievement and people who are gifted when it comes to academics, women who are gifted in math are usually also gifted in other areas. So they're usually also high achieving when it comes to the biological sciences and to verbal cognition. And so you can almost look at it as, and I saw this.
They have more choices.
They have more choices, and they can choose to go into other fields. And I saw this just anecdotally. I saw this at my science and math high school. A lot of the guys there who were very gifted, some of the smartest people I've ever met when it comes to math and science, were not as gifted when it came to public speaking or to writing, creative writing. And they went on to work as engineers at places like Google, whereas a lot of the women I knew who were also very highly gifted in math and science, but they had these other talents as well, and they chose in some cases to go into other fields. They didn't.
Wow.
I went into, well, my major was biological anthropology and anatomy. I didn't want to be an engineer. I would never want to spend all day in a cubicle at Google writing code. Are you kidding me? And if I have other options, and you're going to say that I have to go there, that it's sexism that's keeping me from there. It is not sexism. And thank God I had other talents.
Yeah. It's so interesting you mentioned that, because, I've been around, I have so many Asian American male friends of mine, of course, in that circle, right? They're amazing, incredibly gifted at science and math, geniuses at math competitions, physics competitions, those kinds of things. But they're not, in terms of socially and in terms of those kinds of things, are they going to get are they going to get like an executive recruiting position or like a public relations firm position? No, and that's not because they're bad people, or it's not because of those kinds of things. It's just because their minds are geared towards, the examination of truth and knowledge through a math and science perspective. And, and they're so incredibly gifted to be excellent at that field. Why are we trying to evaluate on them on characteristics that are like completely irrelevant to what they're truly gifted and what they're called to do?
Exactly. There's so much wrong with this sort of desire to reimagine the world based on what race people are and what sex they are, and having the appropriate percentages that make this word equity is so evil. And that's another word.
So evil.
They've gotten so comfortable using that word. They've slowly, over time, they've quit using the word equality, because equity is not equal. It's not about equality. Equity is about forcing the outcome that you want. And people's desires and people's individuality and their, be damned, because you want to see this certain outcome. There's a really funny comic that I saw. I can't remember who did it, but it was so funny, Kenny. It was, maybe you've seen it. It's a picture of at like a career fair. And there's two booths, or maybe it's at a academic fair, and there's two booths, and one booth is a guy, and it's got a big sign that says STEM, and it's a recruitment booth, and the other recruitment booth says women's studies, and there's a line of women lined up at the women's studies booth, and there's nobody at the STEM booth. And then in the next frame, you see the two booths again, and you see all the women who had been lined up at the women's studies booth are now picketing the STEM booth, and they have signs that say "More women in STEM." It's like, oh well, you could have chosen to go that route.
Pretty much what's happening, yeah. That's pretty much what's happening. Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to say about this kind of discrimination that we're normalizing, and that we feel is justified. It's socially just to do this kind of discrimination. The other thing about it that's really sickening to me is that students or people who have achieved, who deserve to be at these places, at these schools, or on certain panels or at certain companies, those people, if they're people of color, if they're Black or Latino, or if they're women, they have to now deal with everyone looking at them and wondering if they got in based on race or sex. And that blows. Right. I don't want to be given anything because I'm a woman, and I don't want anything taken away from me because I'm a woman. But gosh darn it, these social justice people, they just insist on insist on creating a world that's just as bad as one where I would be denied something for being a woman. So I've seen guys in recent years, it's become very popular at conferences and the like, for these male ally, male feminist, social justice people to say, I'm not going to be on this panel anymore until there's 50% women on the panel. Well, you know what? That sucks, because now as a woman, if you get invited to be on that panel, it's like, well, are you just inviting me because I'm a woman? Like, I want you to invite me because I deserve to be here, not because, oh, well, she's got the right anatomy and checks off the right groups. And I hate it. I hate it. And it's not helping anyone. I think this discrimination based on race and sex and sexuality, it's bad for everyone across the board. And, not to mention what it does to people psychologically, especially to children. Like I feel very, very blessed and fortunate that when I was in elementary school, social justice had not yet trickled down to that level. It was still just at the elite institutions. Well, nowadays they're teaching all this crap to kindergartners, and I can just imagine what it's doing to people psychologically. And, I didn't grow up in a time where there was a lot of messaging that said, the future is female and women can do science too, and women can do math. And I'm so glad I didn't, because the way my mind worked, I would have thought, well, do people think women can't do science? Like, are women not good at science? Like, why are they having to like force this down my throat? And I never grew up with the idea that I couldn't do science and math. I never grew up with the idea that I was somehow a victim. That wasn't put into my head until college. And I'm so glad, because, gosh, I was in it for 20 years. Can you imagine if I had been indoctrinated as an elementary school student? Like, I might never have left it. I might have always thought of myself as this perpetual victim of oppression. And I also think it would have possibly caused me to have a lower self-esteem in elementary school, middle school, to where maybe I wouldn't have even made it to the science and math high school. Maybe I wouldn't have made it to Duke, because I would have had this ingrained in me that women are not good at science and math. We need extra help, and we need to be encouraged. Like,
yeah.
What?
Well, and Keri, obviously, I mean, it did for me. And this is a conversation really for another time, because it would be way too long for me to say it all here. But I mean, I struggled with my Asian American identity in my high school, in my middle school. It's because I knew there's a prenatal sense in me that I knew that I was going to get judged on it eventually. And I knew that colleges were going to judge me on it. I knew that people were going to judge me on my Asian American identity. And I struggled with it for a very long time. I thought there are parts when, I grew up in, I grew up in a racially diverse environment too, by the way. But there are parts when I remember thinking, well, if I could just be like the white kids, maybe then I wouldn't have these expectations and burdens placed on me. I was ashamed a little bit sometimes of my parents, who trained me to be good at math and things like that. And I was like, oh, I don't want to just be another math nerd like all of my friends. That's not cool. And I really struggled with that in high school. And this is partially the reason like why I've come to this path, why I'm writing this book and why I'm writing this podcast. Eventually I had to turn to my faith, and I had to turn to Christ and say, hey, my race does not define me. And it's a big psychological ordeal to have to go through the idea that your race could potentially define you, as it still does by all of these colleges that you want to get into, that you bet your life on, that a lot of immigrant parents bet their lives on to get their kids into college, and to know that that they're treating you in this way. It's immensely damaging.
Wow. Kenny.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're probably a bit younger than me. And so I wonder how much of that had to do with this belief system trickling down over the ensuing years. And I didn't know you were a Christian. I'm a pretty new Christian. See, there's a lot that I've gotten from my new faith as well that's helped me to put things in perspective. And wow, you're making me think of, I'm going to recommend this guy for you to check out and follow, or for anyone who's listening.
For sure.
Samuel Say it's SEY. He has a blog called Slow to Write, and he is a Black. Well, he's originally from Ghana, but he's Canadian. I think he moved to Canada when he was a toddler. But he writes about social justice and how it is at odds with the gospel, and he has the most clarity, I would say, of any of the people I've read who are writing about it today. About it, the infiltration into the church. And he just really boils it down to, Jesus didn't preach collectivism. It wasn't about like looking at what race and sex people are and, fixing the world and finding redemption and grace based on acts of collectivism. It was, he looked at you as an individual. Your relationship with God is an individual relationship. And it goes back to that idea of like, you're not guilty for the sins of people who share your race or your sex. And you're also not, able to take credit for the accomplishments of people who share your race or sex. It has nothing to do with you. You are an individual soul. So, sorry to get a bit Jesus-y at the end, but since you mentioned
I'm grateful. Well, because I have, you're right. It's immensely anti-gospel. Look, I think about Galatians 3:26 through 29, which says, "So in Christ Jesus, you're all children of God through faith. For all of you who are baptized in Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you all are one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, then you're Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise." How much more of a statement of affirmation of your individual identity as a child of God do you need than those series of verses? And to have social justice ideology come to you and divide you and try to divide you as a person into all of these worldly collectives is repulsive to me. It's greatly repulsive to me. And so I'm really thankful you brought that up, because I think people need to know that. I think people, especially young people right now, you're right, I am a little bit younger than you, but I think people of my generation who grow up with this kind of thing, need to know that your race does not have to define you. Your group identity does not have to define you.
Yes. And one of the pernicious aspects of this belief system is that because it's about your group identity defining you, and because you get more status within the ideology, the more of the oppressed boxes you check off. Well, there's all of these new categories of identity that are evolving and being incorporated into the belief system. So one of those is whether you're fat or not. If you're fat, you're in an oppressed group. Yay. And if you're not fat, you're in the oppressor group. So it encourages people to stay overweight in a way because it's this oppressed. They view it as part of your identity, like your race and your sex and sexuality. And the same thing, and I think the more dangerous one even is mental health. They've now said, if you have mental health issues, if you struggle with any mental health issues, that's an oppressed identity. And so people are now viewing any of their struggles with like depression or anxiety or personality disorders, mood disorders. They view those things now as who they are. That's part of their identity. Well, you're never going to be able to conquer some of those issues if you view it as identity, as who you are. I think that's one of the most evil parts of this belief system is now you have people on Twitter and stuff, they'll put, if they're in the social justice faith, they'll put stuff like they put all their identity boxes. They'll say, I am Black and I'm trans and I'm queer and I'm fat and I'm borderline personality disorder and I have anxiety disorder and it's like, what? No, that's not who you are. That's not who you are. And now I think it's sad because it encourages people to stay stuck in in unhealthy behaviors and habits, and because they get a kind of marginalized identity from it.
Thank you so much, Keri. Really appreciate you coming on the podcast and everything. Is there anything else you wanted to say before we close?
No, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited for your book. We do a book club at Unsafe Space. So if you guys want to find us online, you can go to unsafespace.com. I definitely want, when your book comes out, I want to put it in our book club. We alternate between fiction and nonfiction, so we can put that in there 1 month. And if anybody wants to check us out, unsafespace.com, or you can find us on YouTube for the time being. I don't know how long they'll let us stay there. They did just kick us off Twitter. So we're still on, for the time being, we're still on Facebook and YouTube, though.
Yeah, well, that's amazing, Keri. I'm so great to talk with you and everything like that. You have amazing insight. Everybody, please go follow the Unsafe Space podcast. I got a lot of knowledge just from listening to you and Carter and everything like that. And obviously not a lot of knowledge from this podcast too. So great talking with you. So that was my podcast with Keri Smith of Unsafe Space. Obviously, you can see she's very bright, just a strong intellectual woman. A couple things that we mentioned that I wanted to really touch on in this follow-up. So first of all, I wanted to talk actually about bell curves, about math for a second, because one, I wasn't sure I did my explanation enough justice in the conversation itself. So I wanted to elaborate a little bit about what I was trying to say about extremes versus averages. So let's use Keri's example. Say you're in a basketball tournament and, say the average ability in basketball for Asian Americans is lower than that of Black Americans, which is, not that far-fetched to say. It's not that far-fetched to say. But there's overlap. So say you're in a basketball tournament with equally skilled people, and think about the bell curve of Asian American aptitude at basketball with like Jeremy Lin at like the very top end. And then the majority of people clumped somewhere in the middle. And the Black Americans at basketball, like at the very top end, you have like Kobe and LeBron James and Kareem and those kinds of people. Michael Jordan, those kinds of people. And, but you also have a very thick average, right? But that average is higher than Asian Americans' aptitude at basketball. But say you are at the average end of basketball talent. Say you're playing in a basketball tournament meant for people who are just average, who are at the average aptitude of a Black person at basketball. You're still going to have Asian people. Assuming there's no racial discrimination, you're still going to have Asian people at that basketball tournament, right? And this is a very oversimplifying that there are only two races in the world, Asians and Blacks. You're still going to have Asian people at this tournament. They're just going to be on the higher end of the Asian distribution. Whereas if they were compared with a Black person, they would just be average. An average Black aptitude at basketball would still be on the higher end for Asian Americans. But now we got to think about something like the NBA. So you can still, basically what I'm saying is that you can still have a racially mixed group on the average end of things. But I want to talk about the extreme end of things. Okay, on the top end of things, the NBA, the National Basketball Association, it is 75% Black. And you have to ask the question, well, why is it 75% Black? Well, because on the extreme end of things, you're talking about the top of the talent. And if the bell curve for Asian Americans and Black Americans is similar in terms of variance, which I'm not saying it is, but let's say it is. Let's say the variance of this bell curve is the same, but Asian averages are shifted just a little bit lower than Black Americans in basketball. Then you have at the top end of the extreme of the top players, it's going to be overwhelmingly Black Americans if the only two races in society were Black Americans and Asian Americans. It's going to be overwhelmingly Black Americans. Because at the top end of things, you're talking about that last top 1%, 0.1% of basketball players. Simply put, if you do a mathematical model, at the bell curve, it won't be mixed at all. It will be maybe 90, 99% Black Americans, depending on how far shifted the Asian Americans are below Black Americans. And that's not a result of discrimination necessarily. That's just a result of differences in aptitudes and assuming the same variance differences in aptitudes. And this is where I go and I flip it with academic achievement, which is what Keri and I were talking a little bit about. Asian Americans tend to be more academically apt than the majority of society. Okay, by pretty much every standard measure, they get better grades on average. They get higher test scores on average, those kinds of things. I mean, I think that is just an undeniable fact. You can look at they study twice as hard, etc. And so there's also, plenty of literature that says Black Americans are comparatively undereducated compared to the average American. When you're looking at averages, their average test scores, their average grades are lower, okay? I'm not assuming any kind of causality or reason towards that, all right? There are many reasons for why that is the case, and hopefully in interviews, more podcasts will get into that. But we have to acknowledge that those facts exist, so that their bell curve is lower than Asian Americans on academic achievement, okay, specifically in academic achievement. Now, if they have the same variance, which is not established, but let's say they have the same variance in this bell curve, Asian Americans at the top end of the extreme are going to be disproportionately represented in the top end of academic achievement to an extreme measure compared to Black Americans. And this is something that a lot of the racial equity types, we talked about equity in this podcast, just don't understand. They don't understand, or they just deny, because I think a lot of liberals would agree with me. And in fact, I think pretty much every liberal would agree with me that Black Americans, for one reason or another, have an education level or have an educational aptitude for some reason that is lower than the average American. And at the top end of the extreme is where you can see that most manifested, which is why you have at schools like Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Mathematics, they only allowed 6 Black kids in their 2020 class to come in under their previous form of admissions. Now they have a merit lottery, So to blame the fact that there's lower numbers of Black Americans, specifically on the racism or implicit bias of the admissions counselors at schools like Thomas Jefferson or Keri's school, South Carolina School for Mathematics and Science, or North Carolina Governor's School for Mathematics and Science, one of the top in the nation, to blame that on racism of the specifically implicit bias racism of the admissions counselors, I think is the wrong way to go. I mean, it just is the wrong way to go. Without any implicit bias, even if a person had zero implicit bias, it is highly likely that they would still select more Asian kids disproportionately to the population of the United States compared to Black kids. It's just disproportionately, just based on math. And so when we're talking about disparities in outcomes, we have to talk about not just the mean, but the variance. We have to talk about, what kinds of bell curves are these? And at the extreme ends, things are disproportionately represented, which is why I don't buy this whole we need representation in all of the elite centers of society. Because if you were to make the moral case of that, I think you would have to assume that there are, equal percentages of qualified people at the top of all racial groups, or equal percentages compared to their population percentage of all racial types at the upper end of the group. And that's just not the case, not just with academics, but with sports, with business qualifications, those kinds of things. Now, another narrative, the counterpoint to what I'm trying to say from a lot of the social equity types is, well, the reason why they don't seem qualified is not because they're actually underqualified. It's just because of the metrics that we use to evaluate qualification are flawed and actually disproportionately biased against people of a certain minority. Okay. For example, take the SAT. These social equity types would infer the SAT is biased against Black Americans. A standardized test based on math and English skills is biased against Black Americans, actually discriminates against Black Americans. There are a couple reasons why I do not buy this premise. Okay, there's a couple reasons why I do not buy this contention. One, if you actually look at the way standardized tests, if standardized tests were actually products of racism against black people and to prop up white supremacy, then why are Asian people scoring so much higher than white Americans when their parents largely came from countries that don't even speak English? If it was gamed strictly to allow for white privileged Americans to gain better access than black Americans, then there wouldn't be that issue of Asian Americans overtaking even whites in these kinds of problems. Secondly, I actually think the SAT is probably one of the more equitable measurements of academics. I know some people are saying like, what? More equitable? You must be out of your mind. But no, you got to take a look at the facts, guys. You got to take a look at the facts. All right. On the SAT math, it's about a 4-to-1 ratio. That is one for every 4 rich people. That is people coming from incomes of greater than $200,000 a year. Household incomes greater than $200,000 a year. For every 4 rich kids taking the SAT, one kid from a poor neighborhood actually beats a rich kid from a rich neighborhood with a rich family who can supposedly hire all of these test preps. Well, a kid from a poor neighborhood actually beats them 1 out of 4. That's pretty darn good. That's pretty darn impressive. Because you know what other metrics of evaluation are also very inequitable? How about extracurriculars? You take extracurriculars. I mean, do you really think that a poor kid from the Bronx is going to get their kid into a lacrosse camp so that they could get recruited athlete for some sport or some exclusive sport? I think at Harvard, I think greater than 20% of white kids admitted to Harvard did so because of athletics. I think it's even higher than that. I'll have to look back into that. It's insane. It's some insane level. So, I mean, you really think that these other metrics of evaluation are any better or any more equitable? So that's the second reason. And then the third reason why I think that the idea that the metrics of evaluation are just not used to predict aptitude is actually because when you enter systems with standardized metrics of evaluation, black Americans actually tend to do better. They actually tend to do better. And that should be very hopeful for you to think about. Think about the Army, okay? There is a long tradition of black Americans in the Army, in the armed services, and there's a long tradition of inclusion efforts in the armed services where black people are promoted and hired and are promoted and can achieve the highest ranks in all of the orders of the land. Okay. In the Army, disproportionately. I mean, you take a look at and you take a look at the metrics of evaluation in the Army, right? You have to go through a very standardized test. You have to be able to complete basic training. You're given metrics of evaluation that are similar to intelligence or IQ evaluations, personality evaluations, but it's all standardized. It's all pretty transparent. Everybody kind of knows the deal. All right. You kind of know what you're getting into. And I think that helps black Americans. It doesn't hurt them. Why? Because they don't have to be able to, game or negotiate their way into white society in order to be able to figure out, what am I going to do to get promoted? What am I going to do to get hired? It's pretty much apparent, how you're going to get hired. It's a very transparent process. I've been able to look it up online. You're given leadership evaluations based on certain criteria. You get in front of a tribunal, you present your case, people present their recommendations, people present their case. It's pretty simple. And black Americans are doing pretty well in the Army right now. I mean, it's a very attractive profession for black Americans. I grant part of that is because more of them are working class, and I get it. It's also a pretty attractive option for elevation. I think, a full 20 or 25% of higher officers are black Americans, and they get to boss around white Americans. I read this book, All That We Can Be, to highlight that. And so there is significant representation in the African American community at a place where things are more meritocratic. And by the way, the NBA, that's also a more meritocratic system too. I mean, think about that. Does meritocracy help or hurt black Americans? You make the decision. You decide. I'm just presenting you the facts. And there's one more thing that I really wanted to touch on in terms of this interview with me and Keri. This is based on our identity, right? This is based on What happens when you put your identity in a collective group, in a collective race? Can you even extract such a thing as identity from distorted victimization categories? You know, I know a lot of Asian Americans, and a few of them are very liberal. I would say quite a few of them are very liberal. They look upon their Asian heritage oftentimes with scorn. You know, I talked about that, a little of my struggle with that too. But to not, look upon their parents, their heritage. I mean, there was this girl named Eileen Huang who as a Yale University junior wrote this essay in ChineseAmerican.org. You guys can look it up. Basically saying, yeah, my Chinese community has been complicit in black atrocity. And we have to acknowledge the presence of anti-blackness in the Chinese American community. Now, are there racists? Is there racism sometimes, people saying mean things about black people in the Asian American community? Yes, of course there is. But you need to understand, it works the other way too. There are black grandmothers and black grandparents, who are also racist against Asian Americans. And then there are white people who are racist against both of us. Okay? And here's the other thing you have to imagine. You might say, oh, but it's disproportionately the case in Asian American communities to be racist against black American communities. There's no research done on that, so I can't confirm or deny that. But let's just assume that premise that Asian American first generation immigrants from Asia are disproportionately more likely. Well, you have to really think about two different ideals here, right? It's just the case that many immigrant communities have different perspectives on race, especially when they're first gen, especially when they're fresh out, from across the world. You think America's the only racist country in the world? Check again. Think about the kind of racism that's happening against the Uyghur minority in China right now. Okay, or think about the kind of racism that is happening between the lighter-skinned Arab communities in Qatar and Saudi Arabia against the darker-skinned part-time workers from Bangladesh and India who come there to work, and the way that they're treated. Go back to that. Think about all of the racism between color and tribes that are happening in Latin America right now. The Dominican Republic, fairer skin actually gave you greater social status. And if you were darker skinned, you were screwed. Many communities have racialist backgrounds, right? Not just Asia, not just Asian Americans, not just Chinese Americans, Eileen Huang. Many immigrants from many different communities. Okay, what are we going to do about that? We could do a couple of things. We could restrict all immigration. We could say, you guys are too racist for us. We're not going to let you in. Okay, well, I think that violates another ideal, right? This being a land of opportunity, this being a place where people from diverse cultures can come together. And yes, when you come from diverse cultures and you mix into the American identity, you have to, in some sense, assimilate into the American identity. And part of that assimilation is to be able to respect other races as equal to yourself. Okay, that is part of the American ideal. That's a really important part of the American ideal, too. I don't think that anybody should, I think that first generation Americans should be taught, hey, if they come from, if somebody comes from a different racial background than you, that doesn't mean that they're inferior, that they're actually equal to you. I think that is part of the American experiment. But guess what? A lot of immigrants have been able to get that. Okay. A lot of immigrants have been able to get that because the American experiment fundamentally works. It does fundamentally work. And by the way, it's not because of multiculturalism. It's not because we see every culture in America as equal to ours. It's not because we see female genital mutilation cultures in Africa as equal to American cultures. No, we righteously stand against them for human rights purposes. But no, it's because we acknowledge that when you come to this country and you decide to declare citizenship to this country and your allegiance to this country, you have to give up some aspects of your old heritage. I'm sorry, but you do. You should learn English. You should learn English, and you should learn the way that we do things in America and this culture. And your sons and daughters should learn that too. Because the way that we do things in America and this culture is we do not treat people on the basis of race for any reason. And I think that is a great sentiment to teach people. And I think it works. It really does work. And that's why, the previous immigrants who have come to America, who are victims of racism, many of them, not just Black Americans, not just Latino Americans, not just Asian Americans, but European Americans too, the Irish, the Italian, victims of racism too, could eventually assimilate and blend in well together in the American fabric. And you know what left calls them now? They call them white. And maybe as Asian Americans continue to assimilate in this society, they'll call us white too. but I prefer a different term, and that term is American. You're listening to the Inconvenient Minority Podcast with Kenny Shu. Thank you for my guest, Keri Smith. If you like the content, please subscribe, leave a review for the Inconvenient Minority Podcast. I'm dealing with these really important issues of race, identity, and culture, of achievement, of things happening in my own second-gen Asian American community, of things happening to my generation right now. If you want to support me about the things that I'm talking about, go to inconvenientminority.com and contribute, both to this podcast and also for the literature and journalism that I do to support your ideals. I thank you, and I pray that we can continue to bring intellectual discourse in this nation. Thank you so much.